All right, welcome everyone. I'm excited to have you guys with us here today um, to the Tri-County Winter Webinar Series. Today we are excited to be joined by Bill Cook from St. Cloud State University, who will be sharing about plant propagation with us. I am Kayla Hune. I am the support staff in the Meeker County office, and I am filling in for Emily today. Um, just a few housekeeping things before we get started. There is a Q&A feature, so you guys are welcome to drop any questions into that throughout the discussion here. And Bill will do his best to answer those timely as they pop up. Otherwise, we will have a Q&A session at the end as well. And then if you have any other questions or issues, you are also welcome to use the chat feature as well. So with that, I will let Bill take it from here.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. As Kayla just said, my name is Bill Cook, and I kind of wear multiple hats. My day job is I've been a professor of biology at St. Cloud State University for 20 years now. I also work with the Extension Master Gardeners in Stearns County, and I've been working with them for about 17 years. So I've been doing some of this stuff for a while. I've been asked to give a general presentation on plant propagation, so that's what I'm here this afternoon. This is really a pretty high-level overview. There are a lot of different ways we can propagate plants. I'm sure many of you have done many of them. And we could probably spend a whole session on any of the different ways of propagating plants. So we'll be kind of running through some of the basic principles of a lot of them. I've tried to throw in what I think about in terms of the sort of major tips and tricks or the most common questions I've gotten over time about this sort of stuff. But you guys will undoubtedly have questions too. So as Kayla said, if you put a question in the chat, Kayla will see it. I should be able to see it. And we will attempt, and I will attempt to stop and briefly answer questions in the middle. All right, so why do we want to propagate plants? Well, there's some pretty obvious reasons for that. One is, if you're a gardener, you want more plants. So you can do all sorts of good things with more plants. Obviously, you can plant them yourself, and then you just have more. You can also donate or sell or give them away. So garden groups frequently have plant sales where they sell extras. Other reasons to propagate include you have something special and you want to make more of it. So especially vegetative propagation, that is propagation without using seed in terms of division or cutting and things like that, produces clones of plants. And if you want to propagate exactly the same thing that you have, then you need to use some of those techniques. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we go along. Okay, so we are going to run through relatively quickly a bunch of different techniques for propagating plants. We will talk about seeds, we will talk about dividing plants, we will talk about making new plants by cuttings, we'll talk about rhizomes, tubers, stolons, and root cuttings. These are kind of other types of cuttings other than leaves and stems. We will talk about layering, which is related to cuttings, but is a little bit different. So we'll kind of talk about them later. And at the end, we'll very briefly mention some advanced techniques, but not really go into them because they're not the topic of our talk here today. Now, as we go through the different types of propagation like seeds, division, and cuttings, different kinds of plants, as most of you know, or different categories of plants are best propagated in different ways. So we will comment as we go through these different techniques about in which case we're talking about annual plants that you plant outdoors and they're gone for one season, such as annual vegetables are really obvious examples of that, or annual flowers. We will mention when we're talking about perennials. And when we talk about perennials today, we're going to be talking about outdoor perennials planted in the ground. We'll also repeatedly bring up what I've got labeled here as potted or house plants. So again, those are plants that are actually perennials in a lot of cases, but are the type of perennials that aren't winter hardy in our area, and you need to bring them indoors for the winter. So each of those categories of plants kind of have different types of propagation that work best for them. And as we will talk about, they also have different seasons to do those sorts of propagation. So those will be things we will repeatedly come back to. All right, let's for a few minutes talk about propagating by seed. And of course, here you see some kinds of squash seeds, just as an example. Okay, well, what time of year should we start seeding? Well, most people, especially your kind of novice gardeners, imagine that seeds are something that you plant in the spring. And we definitely do plant seeds in the spring, but we also plant seeds at other times of year, depending on which categories of plants we're talking about. And we'll talk about all of these. So just very briefly, as an introduction, we can talk about planting seeds indoors in the late winter that you plan to transfer to outside when it gets to be spring. So a lot of people do that for starting, say, tomatoes in the late winter inside with, of course, the plan of planting those in the ground in May. You can't really grow tomatoes indoors very well. You can also plant perennials indoors in the late winter and then transplant them out. We'll briefly discuss winter seed sowing, which is a technique where you can put seeds in containers in late winter outside and let them germinate when the spring warms up. They're, of course, classic spring outdoor planting. This is when you plant your squashes and beans and things like that. Maybe some annual flowers. You plant those in the spring when the soil is warmed up and you get them going for the summer. It's also possible to plant perennials outdoors by seed in the fall. Usually in that case, we're talking about basically mimicking the nature's natural cycle. Obviously, there are lots of flowers that produce seeds in the late summer and fall. Those seeds then fall to the ground, sit there, and then germinate in the spring. And so we can sometimes plant seeds outdoors in the fall for those reasons. That doesn't work, obviously, for things like your annual vegetables. You have to plant those in the spring. But if you're talking about perennials that are going to be long-lived, that can work, or some annuals. And then if you're trying to propagate your indoor plants or your potted or house plants, some of those can be propagated by seed too. And because we're talking more indoor plants, there are different times of year you can plant those. It's not just one time. Okay, anytime we're talking about seed germination, you need to think carefully about maintaining the correct environmental factors. And your really basic list of environmental factors for germinating seeds are the basic environmental factors that take into account whether any kind of plant is going to be successful. So you need to think about water and soil and air available in the water and soil. You need to think about temperature. You need to think about light. And you need to think about opportunities for diseases. Baby plants, of course, are at their most delicate right after they germinate. And if any of you have tried planting seeds indoors with the intention of planting them outside later, it is unfortunately too possible to have things happen like your soil stays too wet, which generates diseases, and your baby seedlings start rotting and then don't survive. When you plant seeds, you also sometimes need to think about whether they need extra treatments to get them to germinate. So stratification is a fancy word that means that refers to a seed that actually needs to think that it has gone through a winter before germinating. Many of perennials that live in our area are like that. If you just plant them in the spring, they won't grow because they need to have gone through a cold period before their physiology will allow them to wake up or grow. Other seeds need actually to be scuffed up or scarified before they will germinate. So certain seeds, particularly big ones with really hard outer layers, you actually need to sand or kind of nick them, and that helps them germinate. So certain kinds of plants have specific and special needs for getting seeds to germinate. Okay, if you were planting seeds inside, regardless of whether you're going to plant them outside later or not, one thing that we can't help but mention is what we are calling reinforcements here. So extra lights, particularly when we're planting seeds inside in the winter. You all probably know that your home environment is a very dark place in the winter. And it may feel dark to you, but it would feel particularly dark to plants, especially baby seeds that are just starting to get going. So your natural light is probably too low unless you have really good windows. And your artificial lights, your normal lights that are on your ceiling, those are generally not strong enough to help seeds get started. So frequently people who are trying to get seeds started inside need some kind of grow lights. Now, I do want to say, you don't necessarily have to have really fancy grow lights. Sometimes a simple shop light just hanging a few inches above your seeds is all you need. So that kind of middle picture, you can buy some of those pretty inexpensively. A big fancy thing, so the picture on the right with a whole big bank of lights, that's one that I have. But you really don't have to buy a big expensive thing like that. Sometimes a simple light just a few inches above your seeds is all that you need. And you don't always have to spend a lot of money for that. We don't have time to go into this in detail, but pots and trays and soil are really important for starting seeds inside. Generally, it's not recommended to use outdoor garden soil when you're starting your seeds inside. You want to use special potting soil. And unfortunately, the kind of potting soil that comes with fertilizer for houseplants is also not the ideal soil for starting your seeds in. So you want to get soil that is potting soil that is specifically marketed for starting seeds in it. There's also the question of what kind of trays or planters you're going to use. Obviously, smaller or thinner planters or trays are very easy to come across and are inexpensive. I have a greenhouse at home, and I actually like to start seeds in my greenhouse in bigger planters, like the type you see in the picture on the top here. The advantage of using those is that more soil provides a more constant environment. So the temperature doesn't change so much. The soil, if there's more of it, doesn't dry out so fast and is kind of more constant. On the other hand, bigger planters take up more space and you need more soil. So there are obvious trade-offs there.
There's a quick question about the lighting. Are grow bulbs better than regular fluorescent bulbs?
So grow bulbs are better than fluorescent bulbs, and it appears I can't see the chat. So thank you for mentioning that. So grow bulbs are better than regular fluorescent bulbs, but they're not always that much better enough to matter. It kind of depends also on how long you are going to use those bulbs for a particular plant. If you're using grow bulbs like I do for keeping indoor plants inside in the winter, if you're just kind of trying to keep them alive for the winter versus trying to get them to flower and grow, and really what I want to do is keep them alive and reasonably healthy until I can take them back outside again in the spring, it's actually not that important, or it's less important how fancy the bulbs are. If you're trying to get plants to flower, and those plants expect a lot of light, then that is where the grow bulbs are really necessary. If you're able to take fluorescent bulbs and put them right above your plant, people kind of don't think this seems like a good idea, but you actually want to put your fluorescent bulbs like 2 inches above your soil where your seedlings are. That means you need to be able to move it up and down when the seeds grow. But if you are able to put those bulbs right above the seedlings, then a simple fluorescent bulb is maybe not quite as good as a grow light, but it can be almost as good. Perhaps a more important thing about that is actually the shape of the bulb. A set of fluorescent lights that are long and kind of rectangular, that is much better than a single bulb, just because a set of fluorescent bulbs just provides light over a larger area much better than a single bulb does. And also, the fluorescent lights are generally cool. And as we said, you can put them right above the plants. And they won't burn them. Whereas some single bulbs produce a lot of heat and will burn them. So we could talk for hours about fluorescent lights, but there's some basic information. Once you've generated some seedlings, then the trick is to get them out of your seedling trays and into where you want them. So part of the art of this is figuring out when they're ready to transplant. And especially if you've tried planting tomatoes or something inside in the late winter or early spring, there's also an art to figuring out exactly when to do that. You need to kind of backdate from when you want to plant them outside and figure out how long it's going to take them to grow to be the size that you want. Also, you have to understand that the seedlings, particularly when they've been growing inside under controlled conditions, when you transplant them outside, they can be easily damaged because you'll be transplanting them outside to someplace where the light and the soil are not controlled nearly as much. Where there's wind, the natural sunlight is potentially very stronger. The temperatures may go up and down in a way that they wouldn't inside. So you need to be very careful with those seedlings as you transplant them outside. And again, most of you are familiar with the concept of hardening plants off. So that's if you're taking plants, including seedlings, from inside to outside, they're undergoing this major environmental transition that we just talked about. The air is different, the wind is different, the sun is different, the temperature is different. So it is very easy to accidentally kill your seedlings by just sticking them outside in the sun. So you kind of need to gradually transition them to get them used to the outdoor environment. And that's called hardening off. I did say we're going to say a couple of, just spend a moment talking about starting seeds outdoors, which is also called winter seed sowing sometimes. It seems like about a dozen or 15 years ago, there is a big boomlet of like magazine articles about doing this. You could use even recyclable containers to put some soil in, plant some seeds, and then stick those outside in about February, and then allow the seeds to germinate naturally at the point in the spring where they want to. Well, that actually has an advantage versus planting inside, is that Mother Nature controls the timing more effectively than you control the timing. The challenge of this, of course, is that once the seeds have germinated in your container outside, they're pretty vulnerable, especially to overheating. If your container is closed and becomes too hot. So this is a technique that is kind of partway between planting things indoors and planting things outdoors. I do want to mention, again, from a few minutes ago at the top of the talk here, that you do want to be careful about which plants you're going to use this technique on. There are some that are not appropriate for this technique at all. You really need the plants to be ones that can germinate fairly rapidly and grow fairly rapidly, be somewhat cold tolerant, because you'll have planted them outside in late winter and they'll be growing in the spring. And you also need to make sure that the plants whose seeds you're starting in this technique are not ones that expect a winter treatment. Because if they expect a winter treatment, planting them outside in late winter is just not going to do it. It is possible for you to artificially stratify seeds, that is, provide a winter treatment. The techniques for that are fairly simple. You put seeds in a container or bag with either some potting soil or just something simple like a napkin or some towels, and put the seeds in there in your refrigerator and leave them long enough so that the seeds have been tricked into thinking that they've gone through a winter. It doesn't have to be really cold for them to be tricked in this way. Again, temperatures in the 30s for 6 or 8 weeks is frequently enough to do that. So we're not going to talk about that in detail today either, but it is possible to do that. And particularly, if you have that extra fridge in your basement, then that is something you can try. Okay, let's move from talking about seeds to talking about dividing plants. And dividing plants is something I'm sure you've all done. But just to give a basic definition here, division, we're talking about taking a plant that has already grown into a clump and dividing that clump. And it's something you do with perennials, and it's something that you can do with some houseplants as well. So there are times where it's better to divide perennials and times when it's not so good to divide perennials. So the key times for dividing perennials are one of them is very well known to basically any gardener. The spring is a great time to divide perennials. So sometime between late April and early June, when the temperatures are moderate and the soils are hopefully soft and well watered by spring rains, that's a really good time to dig up and divide perennials. The nursery business doesn't make it sound like it, but fall is actually also a really good time to divide perennials. I have divided lots and lots of my own perennials in September this year, and I feel very, very confident it will work very well. The advantage of dividing perennials in the fall is that it's actually easier to help get them reestablished after you disturb the roots, as the temperatures are going down in the fall than as the temperatures are going up in the spring and early summer. The challenge this year, of course, is that when we got to late summer, it stopped raining. So you have to water a lot, but that's something that you have to pay attention to at any season. It's not just a feature of this process. You can actually divide perennials in between spring and early summer and fall if the weather is right. This year, I actually found myself dividing and moving around a lot of my perennials in July because early July in particular was not that hot and it rained a lot. And so it raining a lot made it much easier to divide and reestablish perennials. If you had a summer like we did a couple of years ago, where basically it stopped raining at the beginning of May and didn't rain again until August, then that would have been a terrible year to have tried to divide perennials in July. So it really does depend on the weather. There are also characteristics of individual kinds of plants that make them easier or harder to divide. So plants that have shallow roots are generally easier to divide than plants that have deep roots. Shallow roots are easier to dig up. They're also easier to reestablish. Roots that store water in them, like have succulent properties, or rhizomes that have succulent properties, those are very advantageous. So for instance, upright sedums, which have succulent roots, they store water under there. That means it's very easy to dig up and divide that plant and replant it, and then it won't die due to lack of water because it's storing water in its tissues already. Plants that are a problem for dividing and transplanting, plants that have tap roots. And so there is a list of plants that have taproot. One that comes to mind are yuccas. Indigos have taproots. Plants that have taproots are just hard to transplant because their roots go down really deep and it's hard to dig that whole root up and transplant it intact. Also, plants that are, for whatever reason, particularly sensitive to drying out when their roots are disturbed, those are obviously plants that can be harder to divide. So here's a picture of over 100 plants that I divided this spring and actually haven't planted in the ground yet. And I'm not going to until spring. I have a plant sale at my house in the spring. And again, this is a large number of pots that I'm going to save just above ground this way. Now, I've carefully selected the place for this. This is a low spot on the south side of my house, so it's a very protected area. And so in essence, I have crowded a large number of pots full of soil, all right in next to each other, which is going to almost, not quite, but almost act like enough mass of soil so that the plant roots will feel like they're underground. And then in a few weeks, when the leaves fall, I'm going to take a large number of leaves and make a big pile of them on top of here. And those plants should be very well protected during the winter, even if it doesn't snow very much. And that will, of course, we'll find out. This is also next to the foundation of my house and on the south side, so it's less likely to be cold and experience those cold winds. Okay, let's spend a while now talking about propagating plants with cuttings. Okay, and there are different categories of cuttings we can talk about. We're going to talk both about propagating outdoor plants, particularly shrubs, with cuttings, and we're also going to talk about propagating indoor plants with cuttings, because those are probably the ones that you're most familiar with cuttings. Those also have those categories of cuttings have different seasons. So the cuttings of trees and shrubs are generally best done in the late winter and in the late fall. And houseplants and succulents, those are best actually propagated from cuttings during the spring and summer when they're growing rapidly. And we'll say more about both of those in the next couple of slides. Okay, so let's talk about cuttings for indoor or potted plants for a couple of minutes. There are different ways of doing this. Here are three kinds of plants that can be easily propagated from cuttings. In this case, even cuttings of just leaves. So the drawing on the left, that is a drawing of a begonia plant. You can actually propagate begonias just from a leaf. The middle picture is a sansevieria or a snake plant or mother-in-law's tongue. It's pretty easy to take cuttings of leaves, just stick them in the soil and wait for them to grow roots and then new shoots if you're patient. You can also propagate African violets from a single leaf. You just bury the leaf partway in the soil and wait. It can be a long wait. Some of these kind of plants, it may actually take months for that plant to get going, but not bad for cuttings. You can make a new plant just from part of a leaf. Now, I have a greenhouse full of desert plants and succulents, and I use leaf cuttings to propagate succulents all the time. It's actually pretty easy with a lot of the Crassulaceae or plants in the jade plant family. So here is a picture that I took yesterday from my greenhouse. Here is a plant that started off as a seed, no, not a seed, started off as an individual leaf that broke off of its mother plant. I just lay it on the surface of the soil a couple of months ago, and in the meantime, it has grown into a new plant, and you can see there. You can propagate indoor plants with stem cuttings in a lot of cases, and that can be a pretty easy process too. So in those cases, it can be as simple as just cutting a piece off of a stem or the top of a plant, and then burying it in growing medium. And we'll give a couple examples of that. So on the right, we have a begonia again. There is a photo of somebody that has rooted that piece of begonia in water, and you can see there's new growth kind of where the stem meets the roots. In the middle and on the left, those are figures of Dieffenbachias, which are tropical plants that grow on long stems and have big flat leaves. The picture on the left is a swelling on the side of a stem next to a node where a root can grow. And so the picture in the middle is a diagram showing that, again, if you're patient and you plant your cutting in the right kind of medium, and then you wait long enough, that node can grow into leaves, which will then produce a shoot. And then after a long enough time, you can have a new plant again. Begonias, as we've, yeah,
I've
go
got
ahead.
a quick question about the succulents. Do you just lay the leaf on top of the dirt, or do you need to bury it a little bit?
In my experience, both of those will work. So the area that is the part of the leaf that is going to grow the new plant is actually at the end of the petiole, right? That's at the end of the leaf where it used to connect to the stem. So you can either lay it flat on the soil, or you can bury it so that just the narrow tip of the petiole is just underground. You don't need to put, there's no reason to put the larger, flatter part of the leaf underground, if that makes sense. Yeah, again, basically, you need the end of the petiole to be to have access to the dirt so that when roots start growing out of it, they can reach the soil quickly. Okay, so here is another picture that I took yesterday from part of my collection. This is an angel wing begonia. There, I have an angel wing begonia that I have had for 27 years that I take cuttings off almost every year. Here is just a simple stem cutting. I broke that cutting off about a month ago. I put it in soil and I put it in potting soil, and I have kept that potting soil moist. You can't tell, but this is actually on a windowsill right next to my kitchen sink. So it's easy for me to remember that I need to water that cutting. And only a few weeks later, you can see that not only has this begonia rooted into this pot, but there in the pot, you can see that a new shoot has already started growing. So if you make cuttings like this and then keep them under controlled conditions with the right kind of plant, it can be extremely easy. Again, I basically just broke a piece of this plant off, stuck it in potting soil, and have kept it watered and haven't done anything else fancy. Many of you have probably propagated vining houseplants like this pothos before. So this is actually right next to me here in my office. You've got the mother plant underneath the fluorescent, just normal office light up on the top of a cabinet. And I have some cuttings of that plant rooting in water. You can actually see in the jar of water a dark blob attached to a stem, which is where the roots are going to grow out of. So we talked about the last plant. You can root in soil. This one, you can root in either soil or water. So here's some more tips about cuttings, especially when we're talking about some of the succulents. You can take cuttings or make leaf cuttings of succulents at any time of year, but they will by far root the fastest in the spring and summer when the plants are growing actively. So many years ago, I lived in Arizona for 2 years. You could keep succulents outside all winter there, but I learned from experience that even though it's above freezing, kind of really comfortable temperatures, frankly, it was too chilly outside to try to propagate plants from leaves like that. So wintertime in the desert where the high temperature in February is 60 degrees. That was not warm enough for those plants, the cuttings and the leaves of those plants to grow successfully. It needed to be warmer than that. So here in Minnesota, your house may not be super warm in the winter. Obviously, it's warm enough for you, but it's quite a bit cooler than it is in the summertime. And so all of these kind of tropical and subtropical plants, the cuttings will take best when you're making them in warm water. There's also the question about whether plants can root in soil or water. Some people kind of have maybe exaggerated ideas about rooting plants in water. Only some plants you can actually root in water. There are a lot of kinds that will rot if you just stick them in water. They either won't grow roots or they will rot before they grow roots. Or it's also possible for plants in water to grow roots, but have those roots be kind of weak roots that will break when you try to plant them in soil. So again, only some house plants you can root in water. There are a lot of them that actually works better to root them in soil. The ones that will root in soil in particular, it's particularly noticeable if you remember that Dieffenbachia from a couple of pictures ago. You see those lines on the stem, which are nodes. Do pay attention to those nodes because those nodes are where are the potential growth points for either new shoots or leaves. So if you're planting a plant that has nodes like that in the soil, cut your cutting carefully and bury them in the soil carefully so that those nodes are in the soil where you want the roots to grow. Few more tips on rooting cuttings. Uh, it can be better to do it in the morning. Also, younger growth will generally root better than older growth. It's just kind of better in growth mode. And rooting hormone is a good thing to use in a lot of cases. Let's say just a couple of minutes about making cuttings from some outdoor plants outside. These are hardwood cuttings of an elderberry plant on the left or a grapevine on the right. You can propagate some woody plants by taking cuttings at the point they're about to wake up for the spring. So for elderberries, that would be in the late winter. Grapes kind of take a long time to wake up in the spring. You can take cuttings of them until May. And about the time they're starting to leaf out, you can take a cutting and plant it and baby it for a little while and then get a new grapevine or a new elderberry bush. And there are a lot of shrubs that this works for. You can, so those are hardwood cuttings. You can also take what are called softwood cuttings of some outdoor plants as well. So here is a hydrangea where we're taking several cuttings of new growth in the early summer. So think June. And you can see the nodes on this hydrangea. And each of these cuttings potentially can grow into a new plant. To take softwood cuttings, it can be, and get them to grow, it can be very handy to use something very inexpensive like this. So we've planted cuttings in a growth medium. By the way, the cuttings in this picture, I have a fig tree that I take inside every fall, and I can make cuttings off of that fig tree. And it can be useful when you're trying to get cuttings to root, to try to control the humidity around those cuttings. And you can do something very simple, like taking a large plastic container, the kind that pretzels came in from Walmart or something, and just simply put that upside down over your pot with the cuttings in the soil medium. You can also use a plastic bag in the same kind of way. And that helps keep the moisture and the temperature relatively constant. And you can do this both inside, but you can also have a container like this outside for the hydrangea cuttings. What you need to be careful of is if this is in the direct sunlight, the temperature inside this container will heat up rapidly. And so you want to be aware of that and kind of have this bright indirect light, but not indirect light. Okay, so if I've taken cuttings and they're rooting, when can I plant that? Well, you have to wait until the roots have formed, and not just the first second when the roots have formed, until they've kind of matured enough. Honestly, the easiest way to do this, or to check this, is just to carefully tug your cutting that is in a growth medium. If it pulls out, then it doesn't have any roots on it and it's not ready. If it is firmly rooted, it will not pull out, and that's a good sign that you can transplant it to outdoors or transplant it to a bigger pot, depending on the kind of plant and what you're planning on doing with it. Very, very quickly, I'm going to mention bulbs because people are planting bulbs in the fall for growing in the spring. You can also propagate your bulbs regardless of whether they're tulips or daffodils, which grow in true bulbs, or things like crocuses that grow in corms. Those will grow into clusters over time. You can see the baby corms on the left side. As long as you know where those are, after a couple of years, your healthy bulbs will start propagating themselves. You can dig them up and replant them. The trick for these, of course, is that the foliage may go by in the spring, and then you might want to transplant them in the fall, but you don't know where they were because the leaves are all gone. So the trick is to mark them adequately. Okay, I'm going to say a few words now about propagating plants from rhizomes, tubers, and stolons. Okay, what are rhizomes, tubers, and stolons? These are the underground or just on top of the ground parts of plants that help the plant spread, and you can then divide them and then cut them and replant pieces. So a good example of a rhizome is an iris. So the iris root is the big fleshy thing in the upper left. A potato is a good example of a tuber, which is a kind of underground stem. A stolon or runner is basically a rhizome, but is above ground. So that lower left picture. All of these are things that you can cut pieces off and replant. So here are two examples of stolons or runners. On the left, we have a spider plant. That we all know those as growing stems that hang off of a hanging spider plant, but if that baby touches the ground, it will root. And on the right, there are strawberries spreading themselves with stolons, which all those are above ground stems that are helping the plant to spread. And so those are very easy for gardeners to dig and propagate. A variation on this is plants that will sucker. So we're thinking about woody plants like this dogwood. This started off as a much smaller plant where the root system has grown and suckered and produced multiple stems. You can divide those suckers and plant some of them separately. Some outdoor and indoor plants can be propagated by layering. And layering is where you get an area of a stem of a plant to grow roots, then you cut that piece off and plant it separately. So here in this picture is called trench layering. That's where a stem of this shrub has been buried underground by we're intentionally holding it underground with something. And when that stem touches the ground or is underground, it can grow roots there. And later in the season, you can separate that and plant it separately. Certain shrubs can also be layered by just kind of burying the stem of the plant a little bit deeper. This has a similar effect. You can just expose the stem of the plant to more soil. It will grow roots. And then after the roots grow, you can cut the pieces off and separate them and replant them. So again, this will work for multiple stemmed shrubs, such as gooseberries, for instance. Maybe some of you have tried air layering, and air layering is not exclusively for houseplants, but this is what I kind of think about it. So some of our tropical houseplants that you would like to reproduce vegetatively, and this is something that is pretty straightforward to do indoors if you're patient enough. If you nick or intentionally damage the stem of this plant, and then you carefully get a plastic bag or some plastic wrap, put soil inside the plastic wrap, moisten the soil, and then hold it next to the stem. Again, if you wait long enough and that soil remains nice and moist, the plant will grow roots out into the soil, and then subsequently you can cut them off and plant that part of the plant separately. So again, this is something that works pretty well for tropical house plants with tall, kind of thick stems. but it's also possible for some outdoor plants too. I'm just going to briefly say that root cuttings are a thing. Now, you mostly experience root cuttings when some plant is growing and spreading in a way that you don't want it to. So raspberries spread rhizomes underground and then pop a new shoot up. But it's possible for some plants that are spreading that way to take just a section of the root with no stem on it and then plant it separately, and that will grow a new stem. Here at the end, I'm just going to mention, but not go into in detail, some of what I'm calling varsity level propagation techniques. These are techniques that you may be able to try in some cases, but you would have to have a more in-depth source of information later. One that it is possible for home gardeners to try is grafting. And grafting is something that we do usually with woody plants. In particular, I associate grafting with fruit trees, but it can actually be done with other kinds of woody plants. Grafting is where you actually you attach parts of two different plants together and get the stems to connect. And so you have kind of created a hybrid plant. Most commercial fruit trees, like apple trees, are actually grafted. The roots are one variety of the plant, and which is called the rootstock. And the top of the plant, which produces the fruit, is a different variety called the scion. And the advantage of using this technique is you can actually combine features of two different varieties of the same species into one individual. So we're not going to discuss this in detail here, but it is possible for home gardeners to experiment with grafting. Something that is more difficult for home gardeners to experiment with is propagating plants by tissue culture. This is really something that you more need a science lab for. By the way, if you've ever bought an orchid in a store and taken it home, those orchids were probably propagated by tissue culture. Orchids are extremely slow to propagate by seeds or any of the other techniques that we've talked about here. And to produce lots of orchids to sell in stores, you need a technique that can make lots of them relatively quickly. Again, in this case, using the science lab. And so this is maybe not something that is too accessible to home gardeners, but might be at least interesting for you to learn about. Here at the end, I just want to say a little bit about equipment. We've kind of brought up equipment in passing as we went through these different techniques, but you don't need a lot of fancy stuff to propagate plants in some of the ways that we've been talking. Really, all you need in a lot of cases are a shovel or sharp knife and some hand tools. So it can be as simple as that. For some of the techniques we've talked about, we did, of course, discuss artificial lights, which are getting a little bit more complicated. The point of this slide here is that hygiene is actually very important. If we're using cutters or knives or shovels to divide plants or to cut plants into pieces, it's important that those cutters and tools are clean so that we just don't potentially spread disease from one plant to another. So it's recommended to clean your tools in between bouts of this, and to start off with a clean pruning knife rather than the one that you stuck in the garage the last fall. You get off and kind of knock some of the old dirt off in the spring. So this is the end of our overview of plant propagation. I hope you learned a few things and have fun and enjoy your new plants. So Kayla, we're certainly, it seems like we've got a few moments for questions.
Yeah. So one just quick comment, great presentation. I learned a lot. Thank you so much. One question, how much alcohol? Alcohol, 100 proof, a mixture, rubbing alcohol.
So the alcohol was specifically for cleaning your tools. Basically, we're talking about diluted, well, any alcohol would have that effect. But if you use your, you could use your best brandy to sterilize your tools, but that would get kind of expensive. Um, it would be just as effective and relatively inexpensive to get some rubbing alcohol and just dilute it down. So it doesn't have to be 100%, doesn't have to be fancy.
There's still just a few minutes. If you guys have any questions, feel free to just throw those in the Q&A and Bill will be happy to answer them for you. Just a quick note, as soon as you guys close out, there will be a survey that pops up. If you could please take a moment to just fill those out. It helps us to make sure that we are meeting all of your needs in future learning opportunities.
Oh, and I should have said this at the beginning. It did show my contact information on the first slide. If you didn't, you are welcome to contact me at any time. I can answer your questions by email if you have any in the future. My boss, the dean, likes it when I interact with the public and answer questions. So that's something that I like to do, and is good for me too. If if you need to find me, all you really need to know is my name, Bill Cook, and that I work at St. Cloud State, and you can easily find me there at the university.
Question, how do you control fungus gnats?
Ooh, fungus gnats. Um, Fungus gnats, I think a lot of people are more worried about fungus gnats than I do. They're kind of annoying more of the time than cause damage. The best way to control fungus gnats is to let your plant dry out because they're breeding in the soil. So just allow your soil to dry out, and the fungus gnat population will dry down just because they can't breed because it's not wet enough. There are some commercial products you can use. I don't love using products like that in your house to try to control insects. The other thing you can do, of course, is you can replace your soil. So if you really have a problem with pests in your soil, this is not just fungus gnats, but you can also have mealy bugs that are reproducing in soil in your houseplants. You can remove the soil, wash it off of the roots, and start over with fresh soil. That's another thing you can do. I see there's a question about my greenhouse. Yes, I do have a greenhouse, and I do heat my greenhouse. It is attached to my home. This is admittedly a luxury item. Everybody doesn't have one of that. I'm the guy in the neighborhood who everybody says, wow, they've got the greenhouse. My greenhouse is heated. I use electric heat to heat it, an indoor-outdoor heat pump. It is fairly expensive in the winter to keep the heat on in there. I don't heat it to 80 degrees, especially when it's below zero out. I try to keep it just above freezing when it's really just as much above freezing as I can when it's really, really cold out. I also intentionally keep plants in there that will survive big swings in temperature like that. I mentioned earlier, I like succulents and desert plants. And desert plants actually, predictably, do well in a greenhouse that is chilly but above freezing in the winter. And it can be pretty hot in there in the summer.
Wonderful. Well, if there are no last minute questions, I will, oh, just a quick comment. Thanks. Great session.
Thank you.
We will end here for the day. Thank you so much for joining us, Bill. And make sure to tune in to the next winter webinar series on October 21st, I believe it is. Thank
Have
you
a good
again.
afternoon, everybody.
Yes.